The White House announced today that the U.S. is sending special forces and military advisors to northern Syria. Here to tell us more about the significance of this event is CBN Chief International Correspondent Gary Lane. And on the phone is CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell, who is manning our office in Jerusalem. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. To you, Gary, does this, the U.S. says this is a shift in U.S. policy.
Yes.
Is this significant?
Yes, it's a significant shift because President Obama has said he doesn't want to have boots on the ground.
Yeah, he said that 2 years ago.
Yes,
yeah.
But he exactly has boots on the ground not only in Iraq, but now in Syria. So it is significant.
Chris, to you, we're talking about 50 to at least 100 troops acting as advisors. Is this enough to make a real difference?
Not at all, George. I don't think it's going to make a major difference at all. It's sort of tinkering around the edges. And I think that this is just what the Obama administration may be doing, is just trying to do the minimum so that it can keep its critics at bay. But I don't see any significant change in the battle against ISIS with 50 U.S. Special Forces or advisors there on the ground in northern Syria.
And to that point, Gary, the Russians have, my understanding is that they have hit at least 1,600 targets.
Yes. 600 people have been killed in a month now.
Right, and about 1,600 targets that they have hit since they started their operation. Is this the way for the White House to basically say to the Russians, to respond to the Russians that, you know, we still have game in that part of the world?
Well, definitely, because, you know, there were talks that started in Vienna yesterday, and I'm sure they were feeling everyone out, seeing the players, what their positions are. But yes, it sends a clear signal to the Russians, you're not the only ones in the game. We're going to have special forces on the ground there. But it also, George, I think is a lot of window dressing. As Chris said, it's to placate critics and to look like the U.S. is doing more.
There are talks, Chris Mitchell, to you in Jerusalem, there are talks taking place today in Vienna. Interesting that there are 17 governments involved, the European Union, the United Nations. Syria is missing from the talks. What's up with that?
Well, I think that's just a reflection of what's happening on the ground. I think the other big thing is the fact that Iran is going to be part of that, and Iran certainly wants to prop up their proxy government there with Bashar Assad. And just to add to our discussion, George, when we were in Makhmur in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish part of Iraq, just a few weeks ago, we came in touch with what we believed was a U.S. Special Forces unit there already. We talked with them. They didn't want to really talk to us much and be interviewed. But I think we should recognize right now there's probably some either CIA or some special forces already operating at least with the Kurdish forces. We saw the raid that happened last week. So I think some things are already happening inside. This is certainly a public statement of what the U.S. is committing to. But as we've said, I think it really is not going to make a big, significant difference on the ground.
Gary, as Chris has mentioned, Iran has been invited to these talks in Vienna. How significant is that? And you know that the Iranian regime does not want Bashar al-Assad out of power.
No, and as a matter of fact, at those talks yesterday, when the Saudi foreign minister had mentioned that Assad needs to go, basically the Syrians responded and said, you need to shut up. You don't know everything that's going on. You need to be quiet about that. So these talks, George, have a long way to go.
Do you think there's a political solution here?
Nothing's going to be resolved right away because there are deep divisions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Russia and the United States. All the players are not united in the goal to end this war. And as the UN Commissioner for Refugees, High Commissioner for Refugees said just the other day, they have to have some risk involved. It has to be costing them something before everyone finally comes together and says enough's enough.
We're sending these special ops to the northern part of Syria. Gary, help us understand, who exactly are they going to be partnering with?
Well, they're going to be partnering with the Kurds, and I was in Kobani in northern Syria earlier this year, where the Kurds have a major base of operation there, and they're still fighting, by the way, George, against ISIS there. ISIS has been coming into Kobani and conducting raids. So it's, even though it was liberated last February, there's still issues there. I'm sure the U.S. Special Forces are going to be helping them in that part of the country, in northern Syria. But not just that, George. We're also going to be stepping up our base of operations in Turkey and adding some jet fighter aircraft there as well.
Chris Mitchell, to you, sir, Defense Secretary Ash Carter recently outlined the sort of policy the United States is going to engage in its campaign against ISIS. And here's what Secretary Carter said specifically. He was going to go after the 3 R's: raids, Raqqa, and Ramadi. In the northern part of Syria is the stronghold, the caliphate, the seat of power, Raqqa. Today you have the Kurds, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces that are trying to surround this city. Do you think that this is part of the U.S. plan to go after, to retake Raqqa? And if they're able to take Raqqa, in essence, destroys ISIS, the base of their operation?
Well, it would be a significant blow to ISIS, but I don't see how they can continue that program with the 3 R's unless they have more boots on the ground, more U.S. forces. When we were in northern Iraq and meeting with some of the Kurdish people, some experts that were up there, there's a reluctance on some of the Kurdish forces to go into places, not necessarily just Raqqa, but Mosul, and they don't necessarily want to use their troops for what they consider is not their land. And so I think they would have to increase, the U.S. forces if they really want to go into Raqqa. And one other point, George, we talked about the Vienna peace talks. What we're really seeing in a greater geopolitical sense is a real battle between Shiite Iran and this Shiite crescent that goes from Hezbollah, Syria, the Baghdad government, and pitted against the Sunni nations represented by Saudi Arabia and others. And so there's really a great battle brewing here in the Middle East, and Syria seems to be the epicenter for that.
Gary, what do you make about this 3 R's, the raids, the Raqqa, Ramadi? And incidentally, ISIS took over Ramadi in May, and about 70 miles from Baghdad. I'm sure these guys want to retake these key cities, but can they?
Well, certainly, and that's what Ash Carter said. He said that Anbar would be a priority and Raqqa in Syria would be the other one.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. Raqqa, you will need boots on the ground. You just can't do this with airstrikes. And that I was about 40 miles from Raqqa last spring, and the Kurds there were telling me, you've got to have a massive assault on Raqqa. You just can't do it with airstrikes. But here's the other point. So it will need more boots on the ground. But beyond that, why not arm the Kurds? We're not arming the Kurds. And the Kurds say, give us the advanced weaponry we need. We can do the job. You don't need to send massive numbers of American troops. We can do it for you. Just give us what we need. So far, we have not done that.
Yeah, and Chris, you have met some of these Peshmerga, the famed Peshmerga fighters in the northern part of Iraq. Is that what they're also telling you, as they have said to Gary, give us more resources, we can do the fight, we are trained, we know the terrain, and we can take it to ISIS?
That's exactly what they were saying, not only just a few weeks ago when I was up there on the front lines with the Peshmerga, but a year ago they were saying the very same thing, give us the weapons, because ISIS has captured much of the equipment and the heavy weaponry from the Iraqi forces, and they're outgunning the Kurds. And so even though the Kurds are a coherent fighting force, they're brave, they're willing to fight, they just don't have the arms. And why the U.S. and the West has not armed the Kurds is really inexplicable, because they are the boots on the ground. If we had armed them a year ago, even now, it'll make a difference in the battle up there.
Let me add one thing on that, George, because one of the issues has always been, well, we have to work with Baghdad. This is a government. We have diplomatic relations. We have to work with that government, not an entity within that country. But, okay, so you can't do that with the Kurds in Iraq. What about the Kurds in Syria? You don't have to work with the Assad government. We have not been working with the Assad government. Go directly to the Syrian Kurds and arm them.
Real quickly, as we wrap up this segment, Obama wanted to be done with the Middle East. He wanted troops to get out of Iraq. Now we're staying longer in Afghanistan. Now we're talking about troops in northern Syria. this is the whole foreign policy is a mess for him, right?
Well, critics would say that this was because the president did not have some foresight on withdrawing American troops from Iraq so quickly and not leaving a residual force of maybe 10,000 fighters there. And this is the consequence of that. You've seen the rise of ISIS. You've seen a mess in Iraq with 100,000 Christians on the run, Yazidis beheaded and raped. And yes, it is the consequence. Yeah. And you know, the president may be kicking the can down the road for the next president.
Chris, final question to you, sir. In Jerusalem, how is Benjamin Netanyahu seeing these events play out from his vantage point?
Well, I think Israelis, including Netanyahu, are very concerned about this new Russian presence on their border up in Syria. And I think they are seeing, like many others, the vacuum that has been left by the Obama administration has really left the door open for people like ISIS to spread in the last year or so, and now in the last few months, Russia's coming in a major way, and you could say there's really a new sheriff in town with Vladimir Putin. He's really calling the shots. And I think the Obama administration is just reacting to events on the ground.
And George, one last point here. What happens if some of those American troops are actually killed because of Russian airstrikes? Then what does the United States do?
Or even kidnapped, potentially, by ISIS or some unsavory characters. Okay. Gentlemen, Chris Mitchell, our bureau chief in Jerusalem, Gary Lane, who has traveled extensively across the Middle East. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your insights. Please continue to tune to CBN News as well as on our social media, Facebook, and on internet. We will continue to cover this breaking events and to give you perspective. Folks always are looking to CBN News for perspective, and we will be there to do that. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Chris Mitchell, Gary Lane.